Welcome. Welcome to the next session. It is my distinct privilege to introduce two gentlemen, one here in the flesh right next to me, and another streaming in from, tell me which town again in Germany?
No, he's in Cambridge.
Sorry, he's in Cambridge now. He's a bit of a globetrotter, aren't you, Bob? Bob, you're in Cambridge now, is that right?
Well, I live in Cambridge now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he'll be streaming, Professor Robert Turner will be streaming in from Cambridge, as you just heard. And we're going to have a conversation concerning the relationship between the arts and the sciences, right? Between the empirical methodologies of our scientific enterprise and the humane practices and explorations, right, of the larger humanities. We want to see if these two can somehow find common ground. And we're going to do so with the help of two very distinguished gentlemen. I'm going to introduce each, but I have to share with you that there's a connection, because indeed, Frederick Turner and Robert Turner, Fred and Bob, as they've graciously allowed me, are brothers. Fred and Bob Turner are the sons of world-renowned cultural anthropologists Victor and Edith Turner. They grew up in southern Africa, northern Rhodesia specifically, living, as Fred has reminded me, in grass huts among the eastern Ndembu, am I pronouncing that, people. Grass huts for a domicile, but homeschooled with an extravagant library that was partly the presence of their parents, his parents of course, but the fact that they were homeschooled in this setting, as Fred has said, with the use of purportedly politically incorrect books. And here we reference Kipling, Haggard, Robert Louis Stevenson. Oh my goodness. I think we use those, don't we? They were surrounded by the words and the rhythms, the drama of the tradition. So after 3 years, they did return to England. They both studied at one of the top classical schools in the country, Manchester Grammar, but then would go on and essentially in two apparently different directions. So I'm going to start just by introducing Fred, and then I'm going to get back to Bob after you give us some remarks. Fred Turner, BA, MA, B.Lit from Oxford, studied under the illustrious Helen Gardner. Started with a thesis on Shakespeare and the nature of time, but fell in with physicist-philosopher J.T. Fraser and began exploring human aesthetics from the perspective of the embodied physical scientific evidence for something that is known to those who understand that language just works this way. So he wanted to understand the empirical validation, I suppose, the neurobiology of sound and chant and song. And he's interested in how this has affected us and how we as human beings respond. Certainly in the West, what's fascinating about Fred is that he's interested in something much larger. His prey is truly universal. He wants to understand the very nature of the human. He taught at UC Santa Barbara, Kenyon College, where he actually led the review for several years, worked with neuroscientist Ernst Poppel of the Max Planck Institute to discover the neurological pathways of regular rhythm, which effectively is poetry, and is one of the most honored poets of our country. The Levinson Prize, the Millen Faust Prize. It was even nominated for the Nobel. So I am really delighted to offer you Fred Turner.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks for all you're doing for this amazing cause of true education. And hello, Bob. I think we're going to have a good time. How do we get our students to love and care about the sciences and the humanities, or what we also call the classical arts? As Catherine told us in that wonderfully rousing speech just now, that tradition is under assault from many directions. On the far right, science denial of all kinds, denial of climate change denial, evolution denial, vaccine denial, even pandemic denial, a kind of institutional suspicion of logic and evidence as sort of elitist tricks, the identification of the humanities with left-wing political agendas, which is highly there's a wonderful irony about that, because this is exactly the objection of the far left. And on the far left, science denial again, in general, as a white male Eurocentric capitalist worldview, and vaccine denial as on the right, even sex denial we're getting now. There's no such thing as sex, it's all gender, it's all social construction. Large elements of what we know of as critical theory, the idea that the traditional humanities are skewed towards Eurocentric or capitalist or racial agendas. And if one knows anything about the great humanistic tradition, the humanistic tradition is one of essentially liberation from those kinds of agendas. There are plenty of reasons for students and parents to avoid the sciences and the humanities. We here know the fundamental human value of science and the humanities. How do we go about winning them back? Let me make a suggestion. What the students grew up on was to a large extent, Harry Potter. What did they love about those books? And not just Harry Potter, but to some extent C.S. Lewis and, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. I think it was partly the idea of what the young people loved about the Harry Potter books was, I think, the very idea of Hogwarts. It was Catherine's school is a bit of a Hogwarts, actually. The ideal school for perhaps 2 billion kids across the world today. It was a school, a school of the imagination that recognized the unique talents of individuals, that we are all magical beings, the magical powers of the human mind and soul, the hidden secrets of the past, the nature of genuine authority, the pleasures of true discipline and expertise, the hard work involved in learning strange new vocabularies and ancient mysteries. It was a school that had a secret language, and kids love secret languages. A school that combated the exclusivism of race, class, and sex discrimination. What Rowling portrayed was not a mere fantasy. It was based on a reality that flourished in Europe and across the whole of the civilized world in the 4 centuries that led up to the Industrial Revolution. And it was called the Republic of Letters. And I want to talk about this sort of, this was what Rowling was drawing on. She was drawing on that tradition of the Republic of Letters. And what was the Republic of Letters? Well, first of all, it was something that was fully international, fully interracial, interfaith, and intercultural. And, as I said, international. Scholars and naturalists and philosophers and writers all over the world People of every economic and cultural class were welcome as long as they brought real learning and careful research and an open and questioning imagination. It included some of the most pious and religious people and some of the boldest freethinkers and agnostics. Though in theory it was open to all, it was always a minority of the population that had the resources to join it. But we live now in a much more affluent world. Maybe we can afford to make this into a majority rather than a minority. It transcended all political and military boundaries. During the real First World War, that is the Napoleonic War, scientists, artists, and writers from all sides freely continued to correspond and meet, often with the collusion of government, because the results were so fertile. It sponsored massive translation projects. Chinese classical poetry, the Indian Vedas, the Arabian Nights, even the Mayan classics later on. It rescued humanity's literary and artistic past. In one of my own special subjects, epic poetry, the Republic of Letters was responsible for collecting and translating not only the Mediterranean classics, the Odyssey, Iliad, and Aeneid, which was, in a sense, the beginning of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but also then the Nordic epics and the Hindu epics, the epics of Western Asia, Japan, China, and more recently, the great African and Mayan epics. This point is especially important. Too often, when we try to teach minorities the literature that we think belongs to them, and we were talking about this last time, we choose the shallow imitations of the common culture that emerge in ghetto conditions rather than the grand and noble productions of the ancient nations from which they came. Every people has its classics, and there is a remarkable unanimity about their messages. True ethnic literary studies should unite, not divide us. My book, Epic, is what I did was I collected about 60 world epics, and I did a kind of careful thematic analysis of them and came up with around 60 elements that they all had in common, like the descent into the underworld, the hero twins, the miraculous birth of the hero, the quest, and so on. In other words, there's a world classicism, and that's what we are gradually moving towards. Perhaps even more pervasive than Harry Potter in the imaginative world of our students was The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien brought together the discoveries of the Republic of Letters into his gigantic vision of grandeur and beauty. I could imagine a course that simply followed up all those discoveries as they appear in The Hobbit, The Rings, and the Silmarillion. It would be a perfect multicultural class. The Republic of Letters undertook great works of archaeology that restored a splendid visual and architectural past to many regions that had sunk into forgetfulness. Kids love archaeology and discovery. Give the kids what they love. And this point is very important too. What the Republic of Letters did was, we are able in many cases to have ethnic studies because we know enough about the ethnoi, the ethnic groups and their history to be able to have such studies. And a lot of those studies were embarked on by the Republic of Letters. The Republic was based on the learning of a common language, one which was extinct and thus could not be claimed by any nation or tribe, that is Latin, and of course at the higher reaches, Greek, Hebrew, and sometimes even Sanskrit. Rowling's magic spells are all in dog Latin. All children love secret languages. Just read the Opis on children's mythology, children's secret language. The science of the Republic of Letters was based on the careful knowledge of the explorer, the collector, the naturalist, the experimentalist, the observer. And at this point, something happened in the 19th century that somehow the humanities and the sciences split apart. The Geisteswissenschaft and Naturwissenschaft were separated. And I think this was a great tragedy. In a sense, you could say this marked the beginning of the end of the Republic of Letters. The Republic of Letters operated through agreed systems of verbal and mathematical logic, rules of evidence, weights and measures, experimental protocols, and graphical representation. It led to an amazing explosion of technology that brought on the Industrial Revolution and doubled the life expectancy of every human on Earth. Well, who were they? They were, I'm sort of casting a broad net here, but the Florentine Neoplatonists, the European humanists like Thomas More and Erasmus and Montaigne and Rabelais, the circles of Shakespeare and the School of Night, that was Walter Raleigh and Philip Sidney, and Giordano Bruno was part of it for a while, and Thomas Harriot, the great English mathematician and scientist. The English Fellows of the Royal Society that came out of the School of Night. People like Herschel and Newton and Darwin and Hume and Kant. The Humboldt brothers. Goethe, Schiller, the German Enlightenment, Coleridge, and then, of course, the framers of the US Constitution. People like Emerson, too. People like Rabindranath Tagore and Hayreddin Pasha and Rifa al-Tahtawi, because this was something that was also going on in the Middle East and other areas. Sun Yat-sen, I would say, was a member of the Republic of Letters. And, of course, one of the greatest of all, Mahatma Gandhi. It included free thinkers like Voltaire and Jefferson, genius priest discoverers like Copernicus, Gregor Mendel, Georges Lemaitre, who came up with the Big Bang, and Teilhard de Chardin, who was a great evolutionist. That's why the tradition of the Republic of Letters is so important. And I think we should talk about its great explorations and discoveries, from the excitement of unearthing great lost literatures and ruined cities, to the thrill with which we came to understand the universe's vastness in space and time, to the liberation that new technology and new economics and new systems of law and government provided to billions of people, and to individuals trapped in ignorance and poverty or alienation from their human cultural heritage. People are dying for those causes in the Ukraine. Asking questions is at the core of all of this. Shareable knowledge relies on questions, and the process of sharing is unavoidably metaphorical, poetic, moral, and aesthetic, being the animals that we are. How do we ask questions that include as well as exclude? In other words, true answers are sometimes reductive, finding single or simple causes and eliminating others, but also sometimes poetic, tracing the free emergence of new order out of situations of massive mutual causation. Science tends towards the former, that is, finding out the single cause of something. It does all kinds of other things, and today science is very much about emergence. But humanities more towards the latter. but they are helpless without each other. So I think our educational practice should have as its imaginative heart the idea of a secret world like Hogwarts, the old humane liberal idea of the Republic of Letters, shared by people across the world who believed in reason, beauty, and civil respect. Part of it was science, part was literary translation and connoisseurship in the arts across cultures, part was the shared ethics of the great religions. Teaching is an initiation into that world, first for the teacher, then for the student. So I think I'm going to turn this over, and let's have some questions.
There we go. So, Fred, I want to open this up, of course, for the audience to ask questions of what you've just shared with us, but I just would quickly comment that what you're identifying as the Republic of Letters,
yes,
right, with those instances that you've cited, the Florentines, the Royal Society, the German Enlightenment, and so forth, do we see today pockets or associations where some of that is still there, if albeit limited? Are the things we could see in our midst, if we were looking, that might give us some hope?
I think it still is there. I belong to a society called the International Society for the Study of Time, and it's a good example of it. We have people from pretty much every discipline of the sciences and the humanities, and we are asking the fundamental question: what is time? And it turns out that we get part of the answer from physics. Newton gave us this wonderful metaphor of time as being analogous to space, as being a dimension. And this, in fact, goes back to the whole notion, the whole image of time as being like a line. A candle that is burning down with gradations in it that tells you how much time has passed, or a clepsydra in which the water goes down steadily and tells you how much time has passed, and so on. There's what we're dealing with is that there are multiple other definitions of time that come from different disciplines. In biology, for instance, time, the idea of time as a line just doesn't work. The idea of time as flow, as that's the other great metaphor: time as a line, time as flow. How do we reconcile them? What our great founder of the International Society of the Study of Time discovered, that was J.T. Fraser, what he discovered was the idea that time is a nested hierarchy of temporalities. The universe begins with the most primitive kind of time, which is almost sort of timelessness. After that, it begins to, the time of a subatomic particle is different from the time of an atom. The time of an atom is much more, there's a kind of continuity in it, but it doesn't have a before or after or an earlier or a later. Once you begin to get things like gases, where you have lots of entities that are all affecting each other, you then begin to get another kind of time, which involves, for instance, the increase of disorder, the increase of entropy. Then when living organisms come along, you begin to have, the whole range of living organisms, all of which, sort of how can I put it, operate on the you might say, the imaginary principle that there's going to be a future. They all reproduce. Life is about reproduction. It's based on a gigantic metaphysical assumption that there's going to be a future, you know, and a future in which you want to have something of yourself surviving. And then of course there's the time sense of the human language. You think of the tense structure of any language, that is all the various ways in which we can in which we use the tenses, and we have the past, present, and future. But then we have what might have been. Then we have things like if I had done such and such 5 years ago, in 20 years' time, I would be able to do such and such. And that tense structure implies that time is branchy. That is, there are real alternatives. It's not a single line. It's not something, that some divine eye can look down on and see all of. It's much more like a spreading tree. So this is one example of the Republic of Letters still at work today. But I think that there are lots of little groups like that still around. They're fragmented, partly because of the original great split between between Geisteswissenschaft and Naturwissenschaft. The science and the
I think this is...
it's still around.
This is where my question was headed, because again, for K-12 teachers and school leaders, what are we to do? We're not going to send them, to the international study of time, at least not initially. Maybe some of them will aspire to that. But what are we to do to simply instantiate or manifest in some way in our schools that these disciplines, right, must and should and are by their essence, in their essence, related to one another? I'm just trying to think through this as a curricular and pedagogical matter.
I think it's really asking the right questions. I mean, the very simple question, what is time, is a kind of question that you can only answer if you have access to many disciplinary languages.
Although the default would be, here's the physicist's response, and that's enough. Here's our definition.
Yeah, right.
Right? Typically, I think, for me.
Right, exactly. And so, there's an enormously important place for reductive, for the kind of answering that is reductive, because you're going to do good engineering with it for a start.
Right.
But there are all kinds of other answers. I mean, engineering doesn't, how can I put it? Engineering is only a tool. If you're doing something like agriculture or land management, you're riding the waves of many, many different kinds of systems. The ecosystem, and then the various and all the species systems within the ecosystem, and then the atmosphere and the weather and so on. So in other words, we need an art of asking questions that do require multiple disciplines to answer them. And if we had, and this also means, in a sense, that we're going to have more tolerance for philosophy, because philosophy is a way of trying to find a language that is a way of finding the right language for things. But as I say, if it's presented to students as being magic, as what Dana was talking about yesterday about Carmina, Carmen, charms, spells, and again, the word spell also means, correct spelling. If the quest is to find the right magic spell so that, you don't suddenly turn your teacher into a frog or something, then I think that's the kind of thing that will get kids excited. And maybe this also means a way of teaching in which you do follow the question with an answer that is very strictly disciplinary, and then you demonstrate how inadequate that answer is.
Right. You fully explore the disciplinary response to the question.
Oh, yeah.
The singular discipline or the area.
And in a way, that also gives you a better understanding of the nature of that discipline, too.
Right. That's right.
And the limitations of it, but also the strengths of it.
That's right. I do want to leave time for questions from our audience. So if you're interested, please come to the microphone, and I would be happy we'll take a question for Fred. But I think it's apt to turn to our friend, Robert, there in Cambridge, to see if he's got a question, or at least a kind of response to Fred's opening remarks. Bob?
Can you hear me?
Oh, very
sir.
well.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, we have a bit of echo. But that should be right. What you were saying, Fred, is very much, as you know, dear to my heart, and I have very little to disagree with in what you've said. What Robert Jackson has just asked you, the thread that he's started there, again, is actually what I was going to ask you myself. So I don't need to do that. What I could do, though, at this point, is to ask you the simple question, is to ask if in America the education budget was doubled and the training of teachers was likewise made more intensive, and the selection process for teachers was greatly strengthened, don't you think that would immediately steer the ship back in the direction of the Republic of Letters?
The economic question. I don't think what is this? Somebody says the definition of madness is what's that? To keep on doing the thing that wasn't working before. I think the first effort is to find out the right way of doing it. And what Catherine was talking about last time, although I think she's a little bit fierce, is pointing in the right direction. And then put the money into that. Mm-hmm. I have two sons, and I've seen them go through their educational process, and I've had a very clear sense of what was working and what wasn't. I'm not sure that simply pouring money into it will make a difference. I think, it's really a matter of getting our conception of what education is right, and then pouring the money in, so to speak. I think one of the things that I would do, I'll get a little bit controversial here, is that I think that I would get rid of altogether the degrees and schools of education. I would demand of teachers the same kinds of degrees and so on, the same kind of learning and expertise that we demand of professors in universities and colleges. I think, I would, for instance, probably half or divide by 4 the number of administrators in the schools, and use the money to you have maybe smaller classes, better facilities for teachers, more teachers, and teachers that would have to. One of the things that's been going on is that teachers have been burdened with a whole lot of unnecessary stuff that they have to teach, and they've been. And so that they themselves have had to shuffle off to administrators various other kinds of things like advising and I don't know, all the busy work that people seem to be doing at schools and universities. Teachers maybe should be taking some of that back, some of that, the stuff that involves personal dealings with students. Individually. I think it would be more pleasurable for teachers too. Certainly, and I'd get rid of a whole lot of the rules and regulations about teaching, and as long as they're not actually brutalizing the children, then I had the weirdest kinds of teachers. The best teachers I had at my schools were all the weird ones. Were the ones that would get thrown out instantly on their ear if they were at an American public school. So yes, it probably is going to take a whole lot more money, but I think we've got to get the ideas right.
Let's go to the audience, if I may.
You mentioned, for instance, the American Institute for Time. If someone has younger kids in university or high school coming up, how would you recommend they get plugged into groups like this or become involved in this, or know where to go to study deeply among people who value both the humanities and sciences?
Well, of course, there is such a mechanism right now, which is, be born into a fairly wealthy and educated family who know about where the good schools are, and have the money to send their kids there. In other words, it's there already is a system for identifying what works. One of the things that I think that this group, what Great Hearts is doing, is essentially looking at what all the most, the best and most expensive traditional schools have been doing, and asking the question, why is this only for rich and privileged kids? Why shouldn't it be for everybody? But what that would, how can I put it? I understand that this would be extremely difficult to implement because there are vast constituencies that are devoted to various kinds of studies that they deem to be socially beneficial. And of course, we heard from Catherine last time about all the factional hindrances, to put it tactfully, that lie in the way of good teaching. Curricular reform would mean that in many ways a lot of people would lose their jobs and a lot of people would get new jobs. I don't know.
Isn't that what the new economy is all about?
What?
Right? isn't that the new economy, as we're often told, right? That the adaptation of and moving to a new or innovative understanding is
Yes.
required.
Yes.
Perhaps it
Yes.
I mean, I know you're offering, as you say, a controversial suggestion, but perhaps we have to move beyond the traditional forms of teacher education to something
Yes.
that's much deeper,
Yeah.
much more interested in the exploration of the philosophic, right? Regardless of discipline. Again, nothing
I think
taken
there's
away from
one
the
thing,
discipline.
just one thing that makes a good teacher, I think, and that is really, passionate interest in their discipline,
Right.
and the desire to communicate it to
the young. That's right. That's right.
to students.
I think the young man's his question is right? We're looking for these places, and hopefully, on some sense, on some level, what we're doing here will launch a few of
Yes,
those
yeah. In fact,
societies.
great hearts is the answer to the question, I guess.
What question?
What a compliment. Thank you. And I would be, Robert, we have not heard from you yet, but I would be interested in your response to this as well. How do you understand the paradox or maybe the healthy tension that exists between viewing the tradition, viewing this lineage of thinkers and thought and intellectual work as a source of stability and a bolster against rash or unhelpful change in society, with the fact that many of those thinkers in their own time were extremely radical, extremely strange in many ways, and actually quite threatening, right? So Newton is also studying alchemy, and the German Romantics are polyamorous, and they're studying the occult. I mean, they're very, really challenging to the system as it exists. And so, yeah, how do you balance that in your mind?
Oh yeah, I mean the great tradition, was always a tradition of a, if not revolution, at least of evolution. All the great epics that I was talking about, the epics are all about, some kind of huge civilizational change. They're all. The great tradition was always, in many ways, was always revolutionary. I included the framers of the American Constitution as members of the Republic of Letters, and they certainly were. They were revolutionaries. I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I mean, it's just that, I mean, what I'm saying is that it's something like this, that what calls itself revolutionary today is actually the status quo, and what is rebelling against the status quo is what we're doing here. That it's the it's what G.K. Chesterton talked about the this subversive this subversive community of the great dead that show us the way towards liberation. I mean, all revolutions look to the past. They always have. In fact. Yeah, I don't think that we would have revolutions if we didn't have some kind of idea of a golden age.
Yeah. Catherine, since I know you, may I ask politely, is that Catherine? Yeah. Could you hold your question just so that I can try to, I just want to give Robert a chance to give his remarks, and if your question is specific to Fred, or if you decide that it really is for both of them, we'll come back. So Fred, thank you very much, and let's just thank Fred Turner. All right, I will now introduce Professor Robert Turner. You've heard their shared story in Northern Rhodesia, homeschooled, eventually off to Manchester Grammar School. But at that point, their two paths departed, at least temporarily. They went in divergent ways. That is to say, Robert studied mathematics and physics at Cornell and eventually at Simon Fraser University, where he earned his PhD. He did later take a postdoctoral certificate in social anthropology at the University College London, interestingly. But for the bulk of his career, he's been involved in research as a physicist for example, at the beginning at the National Institutes for Health. He worked with Nobel laureate Peter Mansfield to map blood flow and brain function with the echoplanar imaging, EPI, which might not mean much to you, except that function is rudimentary, or the essential building blocks for what we all know as MRI, right? Magnetic resonance imaging. So for those of us who've had an MRI, and I have, we have to thank Robert Turner for his design and development thereof. After his tenure at the NIH, Robert returned to the UK as University College London professor. He would later lead the Max Planck Institute, which I mentioned you had an association with, so we want to come back around to that. He has, and this in the world of physics and certainly of scholarship, 280 refereed articles on neurophysics, physics, anthropology, and music. So just that lineup suggests how varied his thought is. His membership on numerous international societies regarding neurological science and so forth. Again, as one of essentially the founder builders of the MRI, he is a much in demand expert on the sciences. And so we've asked him today to give us that counterpoint to the humanities that Fred just offered. Robert, Professor Turner.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Robert. And yes, I would like to say that, first of all, just in relation to what Fred was saying, the Max Planck Society, which has 80 institutes, is indeed an example of the Republic of Letters. And one of the greatest scientists of all time, Alexander von Humboldt, very interestingly, was a revolutionary. He was a pal of Simon Bolivar in Latin America and helped considerably in freeing the nascent Latin American states like Colombia and so on from the yoke of Spain. So, yes, his life is indeed exemplary as a revolutionary, but as one of the most brilliant scientists of his century. So, what I wanted to talk about, and this very much reflects what Fred was talking about, and I hope it won't get boring for that reason, is the meaning of science in education. By now, it's widely accepted that serious human thought can be categorized under the headings humanities and sciences. In fact, it's striking that some universities even have separate campuses for each of these groups of disciplines. Probably a very bad idea, in my view. For most people in developed societies, the idea of the humanities as largely equivalent to the Republic of Letters, which Fred has just described, is quite uncontentious. Though opinions may vary regarding how much the humanities deserve state support. And most people have some respect for what is called science across the world. Attitudes differ, however, regarding each of these categories. Most of us can feel some sense of ownership of one or other of the humanities, some kind of unproblematic access to the fruits of the creative imagination. Through novels, poetry, movies and TV dramas, music in all its protean manifestations, visual art from graphic advertising to galleries of old masters, and dance from capoeira to ballet. Even those who claim to be unmusical or unable to draw are usually quite able to enjoy and appreciate the work of musicians and artists across cultures. But in the other world of the sciences, there's a big difference. Not many people confidently claim ownership of the insights of science. Scientists are regarded as a special type of person, often seen as unemotional, rigid, dogmatic, aloof, condescending, and even as esoteric. In fact, very often they're regarded also as male. In this context, the general public can even be described as the lay public, as if scientists make up a kind of priesthood. There are obviously many reasons for this difference, but what I would like to explore today are the implications of a particular definition of science, which I found to be useful and robust throughout my own scientific career. That's a career that began about 1962 when I built my own 6-inch astronomical reflecting telescope when I was a senior in Palo Alto High School. For me, science is simply shareable knowledge. It's not the only kind of knowledge, but its special characteristic is that it can be shared. The most reliable means by which it can be shared is by repeatable, controlled observation or experiment. And I cannot argue more strongly for experimental labs in schools as absolutely vital for children to know with their own hands that something works. In principle, once some discovery has been made, anyone with access to the appropriate observational or experimental equipment can then repeat the experiment and thus convince themselves of its findings. However, in order to do this, the discovery must first be accurately described. Most scientific discoveries are described as the relationships between objects, most particularly the mathematical relationship between objects expressed as general laws. So, to even get into science at all, you've got to understand mathematics. For the non-scientist, attempting to understand what has been discovered, the first challenge is to accept that the objects of interest actually exist and can be unambiguously identified. Much of scientific practice thus consists of finding words, terminologies that are precise enough to be useful. Words like electron, mitochondrion, protein, granite, for example. So how does scientific language differ from other ways in which we talk about things? Some poets and novelists have taken great pride in the accuracy of their language in conveying the contents of their imaginations. In daily life, we often need to be precise in money transactions, in our appointments, in our promises to each other. Indeed, scientific discoveries have played a huge role in providing us with ever more precise tools for making precise decisions, such as accurate radio timekeeping, computed spreadsheets, industrial process monitoring technology. But what distinguishes scientific questions from all other questions, above all, is a desire for a general answer. General answer is part and parcel of being shareable. I want to illustrate this with a thought experiment, asking the question, and you probably never guess what this question is going to be. The question is the practice of yoga beneficial to health? There are several non-scientific types of answer. As a person who spends 3 hours per week in hatha yoga poses, I can personally vouch for its benefits to my own physical and mental health. A cultural historian will point to the accounts of yoga, one of the 6 Hindu schools of philosophy, in the sacred Sanskrit texts of the Rig Veda and Upanishads and other sacred writings compiled in India over the last 5,000 years. And they may argue that if yoga was not beneficial to health, its tradition would not have survived and recently evolved into a universally accepted form of therapeutic exercise. A yoga teacher, on the other hand, may appeal to a shared understanding of the health value of correct breathing and muscle stretching. It would be wrong to assert that such answers are not knowledge-based, and for many of us, they are entirely adequate for the question posed. But a scientific answer to this question starts by defining terminology and hypotheses. What kind of yoga? What set of yoga poses should be considered? Why these in terms of breath control, muscle and ligament involvement? What activities should the control group of people be performing to make a fair comparison with the experimental group? What outcomes need to be measured? And finally, how large a cohort of people should be studied? Perhaps not surprisingly, few such properly controlled scientific studies of yoga have actually been performed. There's a major difficulty in avoiding assessment bias. And for several types of comparison, it's impossible to blind the participants, as required by the rules of scientific inquiry, to the type of treatment they've been given. Most studies have involved far too few participants to provide results which have statistical significance, the holy grail of scientific research. But when researchers have tried to combine the results of many studies, so-called meta-analyses, they find that they can honestly use only a small fraction of what has been published, and their findings tend to be inconclusive. I hope that this example shows how difficult scientific investigation can be, even for an important everyday question on personal health. We can be very glad that much of science is not like this. In fact, I think it's actually miraculous that much of science is not like this. In such widely various fields as geology, particle physics, meteorology, molecular biology, and cellular neuroscience, scientists can often discover exact mechanisms that can be expressed in mathematical terms and make useful predictions based on these mechanisms. What links all of these areas of discovery is the obvious feature that their findings depend on observations and/or experiments that anyone can repeat in principle, which makes these findings shareable. It's easy to describe in general terms what gets shared. We share the definition of the system to be understood, a plausible simplified model of it consisting of defined components, the agreed properties of each component, and a set of quantitative mathematical relationships based on experimental observation describing the interactions between the components, which may well be probabilistic, as with quantum mechanics. We expect that this explanation is durable, will enable prediction, and will stand the test of time. To quote from a speech by the Scots-Irish scientist Lord Kelvin in 1889, when you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely, in your thoughts, advanced to the stage of science, whatever the matter may be. So, should we say that science has a monopoly on truth? To the extent that human beings can ever agree about such an abstract concept, it has to be said that scientific discovery can take us a long way. The proof for many of us is the effectiveness of technology, as Fred mentioned, derived from scientific research. Without a clear understanding of how electrons behave in semiconducting materials such as silicon, we could never have devised cell phones, for instance. However, as I've hinted with my earlier comments about yoga, we normally and justifiably believe many statements for which we have no formal scientific evidence. Many of you in this audience, I'm sure, reasonably believe that this session will take 90 minutes, because that's what it says in the conference program. That's not a scientific fact by any means. May not even be a fact. And it has been wisely said that all models are wrong, some are useful. Since all credible science is formulated as models, it would seem indeed to be rash to put our complete faith in any scientific findings. However, we often have no choice but to do this in practice. How do we know what models might be most useful? Here's where the humanities come back into the picture. What tilts the scales most often can be described as elegance or beauty. The same experience of beauty that we encounter in paintings, in the human form, in poetry, in great music. For a reasonably well-trained physicist, the Maxwell equations are objects of extraordinary beauty, as they summarize in 4 short lines the vast deposit of experimental knowledge that we have laboriously obtained about electricity, magnetism, and light. Just as beautiful is the Schrödinger equation, the fundamental relationship of quantum theory, which links the probability of any object having a given position and speed with the instantaneous forces upon it. Once the twin relationships between wavelength and momentum and energy and frequency are both grasped, this equation becomes completely obvious. While its solutions are key to almost all the modern technology that we so casually take for granted. The discovery of the helical shape of the DNA molecule by Franklin, Watson, and Crick, and the consequent profound deepening of our understanding of heredity and evolution counts for me as another extraordinarily aesthetic moment in history. How could this configuration be so simple and yet so general across almost all living species? How could one observation so completely answer Darwin's great questions? So, but precision has its costs. In regard to our sense of who we are and how we exist in the world. Scientific understanding demystifies. It can make the sublime prosaic, like discovering how a magician performs his tricks, or unveiling the Wizard of Oz. That's for you, Fred. Here's a sonnet I wrote about 50 years ago, when I first lived in Cambridge as a postdoctoral physics researcher at the Cavendish Laboratory. Written on a mild February afternoon on the Gog Magog Hills, which are a set of very small hills next to Cambridge. Green veils of winter wheat adorn the field. The larks rejoice in this odd, gentle weather. Lulled by the wind, to nature's will I yield, and let my thoughts and feelings flow together. Wandering along this straight old Roman track, alone now, after a fine week of friends, I sense my force of patience start to crack, though miles before me my dear view extends. Tortured complexity inside my skull bitters the pastoral prospect in my sight. I know too much about that soaring gull to be seduced by its poetic flight. Too much to me does my fierce mind reveal, and richer pain in my sad heart I feel. Taking this thought to its logical conclusion, some people argue that scientific understanding can and should replace all other forms of knowledge. They consider that everyone should embrace the supposed rationality of the Enlightenment, that anything we cannot model and measure should not be taken seriously. But are my thoughts just events in my brain? Is my mind only the operations of my brain? Since I wrote that sonnet, a young man of 27, I've spent more than half my lifetime studying brain science, and somehow I've kept my sense of wonder. The soaring gull still lifts my heart, even though, through the miracle of functional magnetic resonance imaging, I was one of the first humans to actually see my brain in the act of seeing, in the act of hearing, in the act of moving my hand. So, why am I not demystified? Why am I not an atheist? It comes down to recognizing the need for scientific humility. The scientific method has achieved extraordinary results in addressing particular questions which the rhetoric of brilliant scientists and the rhetoric of the ruling spirit of the times have brought to the fore. But the answers depend on our language, on how the questions are framed, and on the limited explanatory models which our finite intelligences can encompass. Consider, for instance, the operation of our brains. As I wrote in a long essay on brain modeling a few years ago, and here I would like to actually do a screen share if that's possible. Can I do that? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to work. It's all right. I was going to put up an image of a brain, but it's all right. Anyway, I'll read out this quotation. The brains of mammals contain some 10 to the power 8 to 10 to the power 11 neurons, organized into well-defined groupings, and each neuron possesses up to thousands of synaptic connections with other neurons. Statistically, despite the huge number of neurons, a signal only needs to cross about 5 synapses to travel from any given neuron to any other. Besides this structural complexity, which is continually modified as development and experience drive axonal myelination, changes in the strength of synapses, the formation of new synapses, and the loss of existing synapses, the mode of transmission of signals between neurons can vary greatly. In addition to the principal neurotransmitters, excitatory glutamate and inhibitory gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, there are 4 major modulatory neurotransmitters and up to 20 less common neurotransmitters relating to appetite and other regulatory functions. Nitric oxide hormones and several neuropeptides, such as oxytocin, also play important modulatory roles in brain activity, adjusting the set points of activity locally and even globally. The high density and interconnectedness of neurons found in the brain are also found in the spinal cord and gut. In the form of peripheral nerves, neurons eventually terminate at muscle fibers and sensory receptor cells. Surrounding and supporting the neurons is an interconnected network of a similar number of astrocytes, whose electrochemical connections are typically of shorter range, but are known to have a crucial role in neuronal signal transmission. In the face of this amazing complexity, how can human scientists possibly make sense of brain function? Scientific understanding only increases when simple models can be devised to describe quantitatively the operations of a complex system, so that given appropriate boundary and initial conditions, the future behavior of the system can be predicted with a non-trivial degree of accuracy. Unquote. So, we are in no great danger of scientists making accurate predictions of what we do next. Despite rationalism's arrogant bid for intellectual and moral hegemony, which has understandably provoked widespread resistance in several countries, especially the USA, on the part of religious believers and those with humanistic values. Science has lost its charm for many. Who would want to take ownership of such a ruthlessly dogmatic perspective? Well, I'm going to leave that question hanging. I want to go on. The best we can hope to achieve with neuroscience, in my view, is to identify the natural kinds of brain disorder and to find effective treatments and management strategies. Such natural kinds can be brain diseases and damage, such as multiple sclerosis, stroke, epilepsy, dementia, and accident-related trauma, or mental illnesses, making a person unable to interact normally with other people. We are making reasonable, albeit slow, progress with the first of these categories, especially stroke. But the empirical biomarkers needed to identify mental disorders are still out of reach. These cause a huge amount of human misery. They damage the life prospects of many more people than most physical ailments, and their research and treatment are provided with a far smaller proportion of public funding. Could the profound and honest writings of William Shakespeare, Charlotte Bronte, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Marcel Proust still be the most credible guides we have to the varieties of social dysphoria? To address this question effectively will require the combination of literary and anthropological insight, compassion, and the rigorous employment of the scientific methods of psychology and neuroscience. To avoid any kind of tyranny, the insights must be formulated in a language that everyone can understand across the planet. Here's the greatest challenge for the next generation of scientists. So that's the end of my prepared talk, and I'm very happy to field questions.
I'll let folks line up here, and of course, Catherine, you may wish to either adjust or pursue your line, but I wanted to give Fred ample reciprocity in asking a question of his brother. And if I may just quickly, before you do, I appreciate, Robert, your emphasis on, as you were citing that oft-quoted aphorism, all models are wrong, some are useful. And as such, our willingness to acknowledge that the very best we can do, even under the strict scrutiny of the scientific method aptly applied, is recognize the limitations of the current model. That is to say, a model which continues to evolve or be enhanced with additional understanding, with additional, as you put it, shared knowledge of the phenomena. That seems particularly helpful. I can imagine it serving as an excuse, right? If all models are wrong, we just wave them off. So my question to you, Robert, is simply, how do we use that aphorism constructively so as to acknowledge limitation while propelling us towards the continued inquiry to understand or study the model, the contemporary best that we have, and continue to push towards that while understanding its limitations? That seems like a fine balance, and I think you've done a fine job explaining this. I just wonder if you might think again for that K-12 teacher in the science classroom who needs to convey the models and work through the experiments, leaving the children some of the wonder that you experienced as your 27-year-old sonnet reveals.
Right. Well, I think the crucial thing is the humility of the scientists themselves. I don't demand that a grade school teacher necessarily shows that same humility in their class. Mm-hmm. I think that they probably have an existential requirement of being a bit dogmatic. On the other hand, their dogmatism needs to rest on giving the children the opportunity of trying things out for themselves and finding that they work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be this kind of dialogue, this kind of dialectic between mm-hmm. what the teacher says is the case and the opportunity that the children have of finding out for themselves that it is so.
Yeah. And you did mention the absolute necessity of the experimental lab, right? The hands-on children encountering the phenomena firsthand. So, questions? Oh, sorry, Robert. Fred, to Robert. Do you have a response?
Yes, I think the crucial issue that we've been talking about and talking around is the whole idea of modeling, of a model. And although you could say all models are imperfect, there are some that are very, very close to being perfect. The ones that are the ones that can be arrived at by the reductive method, which is, making a prediction, creating an isolated experiment, or finding a situation in a state of affairs that is naturally isolated. and then making the prediction and seeing whether it comes out right or not. And if it doesn't, if it does, then you've got the right model. But it seems to me that how can I put it? The problem with predicting certain kinds of things is not that our means of prediction are bad. It's that the state of affairs itself doesn't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, what I'm talking about is essentially those events of emergence, of radical emergence, which have been taking place all the way through evolutionary history. There's no way that you could predict, for instance, octopi and greengrocers and cabbages and Robert Turner from looking at some archaic bacteria. You could say, in other words, that there wasn't enough computational power in the universe to be able to predict the octopus from the archaic bacteria. In other words, there's a whole category of things in the universe which really are strictly causal. But then there's a whole category of things in the universe that are essentially emergent. That really the future really is a mystery. It's not laid out there before us. And it seems to me that the relationship between the sciences and the humanities is a kind of dance around that distinction. It seems to me that we may be saying exactly the same thing, but you could say scientific method is the way in which we find out what is predictable, and that leaves to us all of those things that are so massively systemic that they can have multiple outcomes. And it's those things that that essentially are associated with all the things that we value.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me turn then to the floor. Catherine, you are up.
I hope that my question makes sense as I try to also understand what both Fred and Robert are saying. So it seems to me that something common to both of what you have said, both of you have said, is there's a kind of rigidity that emerges in the, and I'm going to use a metaphor, in the life of an idea, even in science and other disciplines, that rigidity, emerges in a kind of bipolarization. Where you have fundamentalists on one side and fundamentalists on another side. And I wonder if this metaphor of the dance is really beautiful. I wonder if you could speak about, the idea of evolution and in terms of this kind of rigidity on both sides. And Fred, I want to say that you ignited my imagination concerning evolution last year when you talked about it, and how how these vast unexplored territories in something like evolution get cut off because of that rigidity, and how we can kind of pry that open again, whenever we encounter rigidity. And so I wanted wanted you to speak specifically about evolution in the question of how to pry open those unexplored questions. Anyhow, I hope that made sense.
Go ahead.
Well, I thought it was a
Well,
question
that was not to Robert as much as to, was it to Bob?
Well, you both can talk about it because you described this kind of problem of rigidity.
Okay.
What I would call rigidity or calcification or some kind of dogmatism that closes the door on paradox, on questions that remain unanswered. If I go to my, materialist psychiatrist who only, believes in determinism in a kind of, radical way, he's not going to open, the door to other possibilities. And so that dogmatism shuts off my own, experience or my own
Capacity. for growth.
capacity
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where did we get? Should we start with Robert?
Bob?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I wanted to comment. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful question. I think that it's a question that's actually been studied in cognitive neuroscience to a certain extent, in trying to classify humans as some humans being much more worried about rules and order, and others being much less worried about rules and order. And this kind of maps onto a right-left spectrum as well, politically. I think what I want to say to people who find it very hard to let go of beliefs and rules that they've brought up with is that there is another broader universe which is still ordered, which is still got its own internal logic to it, and is graspable through what we have learned through science. And that this is a world in which, as Fred says, so much is emergent, so many things, new things can happen, there can be new possibilities, but there is still something you can trust, you can rely on. And I feel that it's, when people become hardened, dogmatic in their ways and try to impose that on other people, they've lost the opportunity to find a higher sense of order, a greater sense of order, a more Dantean sense of order.
I want to take another question then. And Fred, I'm going to come back to you because specifically Catherine asked about or was inspired by your talk last year concerning evolution. So I'd like to come back to that, but if I could just put a pin in that one so we can hear what you'd like to know from Robert.
Thank you. This was just wonderful. I have so many questions, but the one that I want to ask most is actually about a paper I was reading the other day by Dr. David Hestenes of Arizona State University. He's a physics professor who championed the modeling instruction that we use in many Great Hearts science classes. I teach science. And his paper lamented the divorce of physics and math instruction, how in teacher training now, most physics teachers, you have to have math to teach physics, but not the other way around. And the latest National Science Foundation statistics I found were that only about 40% of all U.S. high school students take physics. So I wondered what your thoughts are on that first, and if you think that perhaps one way we could begin sparking more productive conversations between humanities and science is to nurture that relationship back between math teachers and physics teachers to unite around something like the beauty and wonder of Schrodinger's equation.
There we go. Robert?
Well, I would love to see much more of that. I'd like to comment that not having some kind of basic training in maths and physics is, in this day and age, is like not having a bank account. You can't. It's very hard to participate in the world today if you don't have these kind of basic, solid understanding of how, or at least beginnings of understanding of how things actually work and how you can talk about them quantitatively. And it seems to me that that's every modern state should feel an obligation profound obligation to provide that kind of understanding to everybody they can possibly reach.
We might need to.
And of course, math and physics being so interwoven with each other, as my question had just mentioned, I don't think we can allow them to drift apart.
A suggestion would be to add or create addendum to E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy so that genuine cultural literacy must encompass mathematics and physics as a part of any modern citizen's literacy. We had another question from the table, and I am mindful, given our discussion of time and Robert's comment, that it is coming up on 90 minutes. I just want you to know, when that passes, we're going to have to redefine our time boundary continuum here. But from the field.
Yeah, thank you so much. The topic sparks so many questions, but I have to pick one. So I'm curious what you think. You mentioned, and this is for both of you. Fred, you mentioned maybe getting rid of these educational schools to help teachers and lower areas. But what else, what do you think kind of the key levers of reform at the university level would be to help create thinkers who are not so specialized or dogmatic in one area, to keep this, the way your mind works and your brother's mind works, seems to be the exception rather than the rule. How do we continue, how do we bring about that reform?
Shall I?
Please.
Yeah. Do you need me up by the...
I think you're fine. Do they have the camera? Yeah, the camera's on.
Okay, yeah.
That's right.
I know of, or have run across, and in fact helped to start, programs. We at Kenyon College, for instance, we had the integrated program in humane studies that included social sciences, literature, art, and natural scientists. And we devised, there were 6 faculty members, and we had plenary lectures, and then we had seminars, and we had tutorials. It was educational paradise. And we had this wonderful comprehensive reading list that included sort of great classics from the humanities, but also major scientific discoveries and the kind of logic that went into them. It's just, this is something that I think is soluble, but it's soluble, and I've come across other programs like this in different parts of the country. But it's one of these things that is maybe soluble only from the bottom up, that is, people actually have to get together and do it. Mm-hmm. Now, there is an inducement because it's tremendous fun doing this. I mean, you get to become really good friends with the other faculty members from different disciplines in it, and through the students, are thrilled by the difference in perspective among the faculty and like to see the faculty disagree with each other. So I would say, go forth and do it. Now, I think the only kind of top-down organizational kind of element would be for administrators to be on, to encourage this and to fund it whenever it comes along, and to, how can I put it, base the funding not just on what is considered to be, at the university level, not just what is considered to be cutting edge, but also what is considered to be, let's say, related to larger paradigms of how the different disciplines interact with each other. So it has to be done, I think. It has to to be a bottom-up thing, but it needs to be encouraged by a wonderful flow of money from above.
Robert, would you add to that?
Yes, I wanted to comment that one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life was to go to Cornell University and be forced to take a course outside of my major every year for the 4 years that I was there. That enabled me to take a full year course in French literature, a full year course in ancient history, and a wonderful full year course in semantic philosophy. And all of those have stood me in enormously good stead for the rest of my life. And I think every university should have such compulsory courses outside the major.
Good recommendation. We're going to take one more question from the floor and call it.
My question is about we talked about models, it's about the model of current schools. And Fred, you were talking earlier about how there's this division between arts and sciences, and it's kind of missing the point on how knowledge is kind of should be integrated, it's all part of one fabric. So my question is, in what ways in a classical school should the model of school kind of be shifted away from a discipline-specific kind of classes? For example, we have a class or a course on truth, beauty, and goodness that kind of overviews, the transcendentals across different disciplines, something like that? And do you have any practical suggestions for teachers on how to integrate the disciplines, K through 12?
Yeah. It seems to me that, for instance, supposing one did have a course on the great values, truth, goodness, beauty. Now, I would say that would probably be, in some ways you could say, I can imagine a university in which that was the only department. That was the only subject, right? And that that one, if I, the content of the classes would be a kind of mining down from the big question, for instance, well, truth, goodness, and beauty, what do you mean by truth? And then, what do you mean by truth? Well, you'd then say, well, what kinds of truth are there? And then you'd get down to, for instance, empirical truth. And then clearly you would say, well, what do you mean by empirical? And then you'd be getting into what Bob has been talking about, about experimental protocols and what have you. Or that you might say, well, logical, there are the kinds of truth that you only know are true if you go and check them out. Empirical ones, but then there are also truths that are true by definition, like the fact that triangles contain 180 degrees. You don't need to check a whole lot of triangles and measure them to find out. You just know, it's by definition. Then there are also truths which are true just by the statement of them. That is, Congress enacts this law this bill into law, or I thee wed, or red threes are wild if you're dealer, These are performative truths.
Right.
And so
sorry, that was just one particular random suggestion.
In other words, you start out with the big questions, and then you dig down to very specific questions, and you could do the same thing with beauty, for instance, and goodness, and so on.
That was just one random suggestion. My question more generally was, in what ways is the current model of school preventing us from helping students appreciate the integrity of all of knowledge? And do you have any suggestions on how it should be changed? The truth, beauty, and goodness was just a random suggestion.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't see. People talk about fields, and the model of a field is that there's this huge plain, and then it's divided up into little squares with hedges or walls or fences between them, disciplinary fences we say. Whereas the reality is much more like a gigantic solid, or even a sort of pyramid. In which disciplines like the humanities are kind of based upon, themselves are, that you can dig into the humanities by looking at the social sciences, you dig into the social sciences by looking at the biological sciences, you dig into them by looking at chemistry, you dig into that by looking at physics, and you dig into that by looking at mathematics. That it's more like a solid rather than a bunch of fields. And if we had the right kind of model, then I think we might be doing teaching better.
Robert, any last suggestions regarding integration, a more integrated vision, right, of education?
I can't really add much to what Brad has said, though I also want to comment that what we call disciplinary boundaries often are completely arbitrary and artificial.
They're often
artificial.
One more time, Robert. They're what?
They're artificial.
Artificial.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
They're artifactual.
Yeah.
I mean, they're mathematical physicists, and there are many physicists who use a lot of maths who don't call themselves mathematical physicists.
Yeah. They're
And of course,
budgetary
there's a
categories.
journal of chemical physics, and there's a journal of physical chemistry. There's completely separate journals.
Yeah.
And of course, sociology and anthropology desperately try to separate themselves from each other, but they're very, very, very continuously linked.
Right.
Well, I have to say, to have two of you, one having contributed greatly to the revitalization of form and tradition, the new formalists, right? A major leader there. And then to meet the man who helped to take the images that I needed last year. We don't need to talk about that, but thank you, Robert. I am so delighted that we've had the Turner brothers, and I am so thankful for your time today, helping us to better understand that integration of the arts and the sciences. Thank you.
Thanks for being a great chair, Robert.
Great questions, too. Thank you.